Today on Media Production Pro, I'll show you how to separate hair from backgrounds in Photoshop so your selection can go from this to this. I don't want to admit how many times I've had to separate someone from a background in an image only to struggle with the hair. Getting everything to look just right can be difficult, and eventually, if you're like me, you end up just doing a feathered brush selection around the edge of the hair. But it doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to suffer. You can get help. You can be different. Luckily, Photoshop actually comes with a selection tool that's perfect for making hair selections look great, the Select and Mask tool. With a multitude of configurable settings, you can hone in the selection to look exactly how you want across different backgrounds and hairstyles. So let's check it out. So first thing you want to do is select your subject. If you have the option, pick a photo that's going to make it easier to separate the subject from the background. Photoshop looks for things like color and value contrasts, so a visually distinct background works great. In this example, I've got this photo here, which has this bright red background similar to her beanie. That color similarity is going to cause some problems with selection, and I'll show you how to get around that. Don't put yourself through unnecessary struggle just because of the photo you chose. Pick one that makes it easier on yourself, if you can. In order to do the effect we want, we need an initial selection, and the easiest way to do this is by selecting your layer and hitting Select Subject at the top. Photoshop does a really good job of ballparking the selection you're going to want, so it makes for a good base. Always take a closer look though around the selection to make sure there aren't any weird areas sticking out or parts missing from the subject. You'll notice in my image, this little chunk of the beanie is missing, so I'm going to fix that here. Only the main parts of the hair need to be selected, not every strand. Click Select and Mask at the top once you're ready for the next step. Photoshop changes to a special layout dedicated to adjusting and refining your selection. I'll quickly explain the tools and settings here, then show you the trick to cutting out hair. On the left, you got three main brushes you're going to be using. The first one is the Quick Selection tool, which allows you to click and drag areas to be automatically added to your selection. This is what you'd use if you were missing chunks of an arm or face or something. The second brush is the Refine Edge brush, or as I like to call it, the Refine Edge brush. That's what I like to call it. This brush is what we're going to use on hair, and it works wonders. The third tool is just the brush tool. It just adds or subtracts from your selection using a circle radius. It's just a straight up brush. The panel on the right allows you to make adjustments to your existing selection. At the top, you can change the view mode, which lets you preview your selection on different background types. I like to use on white, and I put the opacity at around 50 to 80%. It's just my preferred setting. In edge detection, you can set a radius, and Photoshop will adjust the way it detects edges for the Refine Edge tool. This is a bit finicky, but it can really change your selection, so just play around with this setting. I recommend keeping it at either 0 pixels entirely or like 2 to 3 pixels, and always make sure Smart Radius is checked. Under Global Refinements, I always suggest you turn up the Smooth slider slightly. This helps to get rid of any rough looking selection lines created by like grain or artifacting and tries to smooth them out. The Feather slider is really useful, but don't crank it up too much because it can make your selection look way too blurry. The Contrast slider will help with areas in the selection that are slightly faded. Slide it around and you'll see what is changing on your image. Just don't go too high on the contrast because it'll actually darken some areas pretty heavily. Shift Edge is great too because you can slide it to a negative value and it'll make sure your selections don't extend past things like, hair strands, so you don't get background elements in your selection. Try to keep this under like -7%. Lastly, we got Decontaminate Colors. This is a badass setting that'll try and match colors in your selection to colors around it. That way you can fill in those weird color spots in certain areas. Try these settings in your own image because their effects can vary dramatically depending on what you're working with. We'll start with the hair. Grab the Refine Edge tool and click slightly inside the hair and brush outwards around the edges. It can take a few tries to get it to look how you want. It takes some practice, but you'll figure out the tool. Just keep brushing around the edge until you've got a rough selection around the entire hair. You might see some weird artifacting like these pixels I've got here. Try and minimize them, but we can get rid of them pretty easily later and I'll show you that. Mess around with the settings to get the look you want. Just try and keep it sharp and not too blurry or feathered. Less is more here. Once you have your selection, at the bottom, choose Output to, New Layer with Layer Mask. Now you've got a nice mask on your image, which we can adjust and play with as we need. Alt-click on the mask in the layers, and we can see this black and white visualization of our mask. It's looking pretty good, but we need to clean up those artifacting spots I mentioned earlier. So press B for the brush tool and just quickly paint these out. You'll also notice some areas that have this cloudy, fuzzy masking, like these parts of her hair. A nice way to clean these up is to switch your brush mode to overlay up here. Make sure your brush has the hardness turned way down and just gently brush over these areas. The overlay mode is going to retain the main white parts and it'll get rid of that fuzz, so just use it sparingly. Now our selection's looking nice and clean. You'll notice in my image, you can actually see through parts of her hair, which is revealing the background that we've just masked out. You can easily patch that up using the clone stamp tool by pressing S. Zoom in, alt-click on an area of her hair, and it'll use that as a sample. You can quickly cover up these background spots, just be careful not to paint over her neck or chin. Don't spend too much time on perfecting all these little edits, just make quick fixes. It doesn't have to be perfect. With that, we've got this cutout that looks great, especially around the hair, and it only took us like 15 minutes tops. You've been officially freed from your hair masking suffering. That's the basics of the Select and Mask tool, but it'll help you start getting your selections to look a lot better. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. It took me a long time to ignore my perfectionist habits. In the industry, you don't want to spend extraneous amounts of time on tiny little details almost no one will notice. Focus on the major stuff first, polish, and ship. Thanks for checking this video out. We're always looking for ideas for new videos, so leave a comment with your feedback or a video topic you want to suggest. I'll see you in the next one.